Hello, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. So I just wanted to have a quick conversation around something that's been bugging me in terms of the discourse surrounding the recently released DLC for Cyberpunk 2077, Phantom Liberty. And not just the discourse around my boy Idris Elba being in it. I am always here for Idris, and I love it for him. I mean, frankly, my biggest critique of Star Trek Beyond, which is one of my favorite Star Trek movies, is the fact that it didn't utilize Idris Elba enough in that film. That was just a waste of my boy Idris. So I am always here for Idris. So sadly, I'm not going to be talking about him, but rather the fact that there has been a rewriting of history surrounding Cyberpunk 2077 and the criticisms that came out when the game released in comparison to where the game is now a few years on with the release of Phantom Liberty, as well as a patch that sort of fixes up a lot of the bugs and weird issues that were going on with the game when it released. A lot of people, since Phantom Liberty and this new patch have been released, have been saying that this was a comeback for Cyberpunk 2077. There was even an article I saw that said that this patch and DLC fixes what was a flawed masterpiece in the original Cyberpunk 2077 work. And it sort of led to this narrative that, like, yeah, Cyberpunk and CD Projekt Red, the company that made Cyberpunk, is back, and like it just fixes all the problems and everything's great, and like, look, it's a No Man's Sky situation where like this game that was critically derided by fans has somehow come back around into being in the good graces of everybody and everyone really loving it. Also, especially after Cyberpunk Edge Runners, which was generally well received by the public, even though I had some criticisms of that show, I actually really liked it as well. So there's just been this giant perceptual shift in Cyberpunk 2077, and that's been quite a shift considering if you remember what Cyberpunk 2077 was dealing with when it released. I mean, people were making fun of it. It was pulled from the PlayStation Store for how buggy it was. There's videos all over YouTube about like all the bugs that people are encountering. Like, people were pissed off about this game. People were asking for refunds, and it was honestly one of the worst game launches I think I could ever think of. I really can't think of a worse game launch than Cyberpunk 2077. The expectations were here, and what came out was here. And so this shift in the narrative has been like a great thing for Cyberpunk 2077, even so much so that like there's been this shifting of the history in people's minds, because recently Cyberpunk 2077, president of PR, I believe, came out and said like, oh yeah, I mean, it came in like a meme to hate on Cyberpunk 2077. Like, people were just, it was cool to make fun of it, and that's why we became such this like big talked about topic. And yes, the biggest discourse that was happening was, oh, look at all the bugs in the game. But it kind of was missing the forest for the trees, because the bigger question that many people were asking at the time that Cyberpunk 2077 came out was, why was it so buggy? And the answer was that they, number one, crunched their workers working on Cyberpunk 2077, which was something that CD Projekt Red said they were intentionally not going to do several years before on Cyberpunk 2077. And then two, the very capitalist aims of the company that was making it. They had delayed the game a few times before because this game was so ambitious and was so big, as they should have done. But then the people in charge of the company decided, like, look, we need to adhere to all the shareholders, we need to adhere to fan expectations and release it now, even though it's not entirely ready. And that's why it came out so buggy, because they crunched their workers and because they did not allow them the time to be able to work on the product and make it what it should have been at release. And so the conversation that came out of that should have been, what is CD Projekt Red doing to make sure that its treatment of its workers never gets this bad again? Or in terms of the people running CD Projekt Red, to create a realistic set of expectations for their workers and for their products, instead of going out and saying this is going to be the best game of all time, setting realistic expectations for the market, as well as for their shareholders, as well as for their workers. But none of that happened. We have now come back around this discourse like, oh, they fixed the bugs. Oh, they fixed the things that people were memeing about. And so we can create this narrative that like, oh, we fixed it now, it's all good. We can sort of like go back and we can kind of forget about the bad stuff that we did. Don't really worry about that. Don't ask those questions. Like, no, there were significant real world problems. And it kind of goes back to this problem that I see a lot within the quote-unquote gamer community, is that, people will get upset when like their game is buggy, when it's, not working right, or, a launch is weird, but very rarely will there be this staying power for discussing things like, workers' treatment behind the scenes of video games. A lot of the times people will not even care about anything that's going on behind the scenes of a video game. they won't care about questions of crunch or things like that. And it just frustrates me because, like, these things that people get upset about, the fact that games are sometimes buggy when they release, they aren't completely finished, the games feel very shallow because they're very much working on a games as service model, which is just trying to crank as much money and microtransactions out of you as possible, all stem from the same root that causes workers to also face crunch, which is everyone's focused on just their capitalist goals and trying to make the most money instead of making works of art. This is the problem with capitalism overall, obviously. But it frustrates me. It's like, yeah, screw the workers. I want them to work super hard. I want them to constantly, crunch and do all this work to make the game that I really want. And I'm not even going to give a crap about that. But if it's buggy, I'm going to be frustrated as all hell and rant about it and how it only affects me instead of actually thinking about the larger systemic issues that are causing both of the same problems that we want to be talking about. And so it's just a very frustrating shift in the narrative that I've seen with a lot of, we know the certain segments of fans that are, so willing to get so pissed off if their game is buggy or has pronouns in it or something like that. I don't know what I'm alluding to there, but won't actually talk about the workers behind the scenes, won't talk about, the larger problems that we should be focusing on in terms of workers' treatment in the video game industry, because it is atrocious. I mean, a lot of focus, rightly so, has been put on the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes, as well they should, in Hollywood right now, but the same issues are existent, if not even more so, and perhaps definitely more so, in the video game industry, both for actors, writers, and also the developers working on things. So people will often use phrases like, we need to think about the developers to justify needing to purchase a video game or because they want to play it, but not actually really caring about the working conditions of the developers. Really what they say when they mean we need to support the developers is we need to support the corporations that the developers work for because we just want the game that we like. We want to make sure they get a lot of money when really that money never actually trickles down to the working class folks who are working on video games. I mean, just look at freaking EA for a perfect example of that, or Activision Blizzard. So it's really, really frustrating me to see the shift in the discourse around Cyberpunk 2077. And I say that as someone who likes the game, by the way. Like, I played a lot of Cyberpunk 2077 came out. I enjoyed it. I have criticisms of some elements of the story. I think that echoes the wonderful Sophie from Mars video that she did. I highly recommend that video if you want like a good dissection and analysis of Cyberpunk 2077. So I like the game and I have criticisms of it. I have criticism of all art, but really the bigger problem for me and the biggest discussion for me is like, yeah, I'm glad that the artist's work is getting appreciated more now after the release of Phantom Liberty and this new patch, but we're not actually talking about the working conditions that those artists are working on. And even more so, by the way, I should even say this, just to be very clear to wrap out here, like, hopefully the working conditions at CDPR have improved since this has happened. Like, if that has happened, great. I would like to see some evidence of that, some discussion of that, some of that being put forward in these discourses, but it is also very important that we do not rewrite history and forget what the problems that caused CD Projekt Red and Cyberpunk 2077 to have these issues in the first place was, because if we forget that, it's just allowed to continue happening again, either at CD Projekt Red or at other companies. So yes, if they fix things, that's awesome. That should be the case for every single company, not just CDPR. And if it hasn't changed, we need to be talking about that even more so.